Welcome to Deloitte M&A Views, a Deloitte podcast series exploring the latest trends and topics in mergers and acquisitions. Today the topic is spinoffs, the uncertainty, the costs, how to plan for and control both. Now we're joined by Deloitte's Jason Asper to discuss what to expect when planning for spinoffs. Jason, thanks for spending some time with us today to talk about spinoffs, more specifically about possible cost and impact. Now, I know this is a big deal for a lot of people who are listening since both are so hot right now. Everyone wants to know what they may be getting into, so let's get right to it. Say you're interested in pursuing a spinoff right now as one option among several other potential deal models. What should you be anticipating in terms of cost?
Great, and thank you, and happy to be speaking with you today and share some perspectives. And that's a great question, and we get this question quite often as our clients are considering a strategic transaction. I would highlight the cost in general is a broad category, and I would typically think about costs in three major buckets. First, transaction, so think financing, tax, and legal fees. Secondly, in terms of separation costs, these are typically functional costs, IT, HR, operations. And thirdly, employee-related costs, which can be structuring, severance, relocation, or other costs related to employees. To answer your question directly, there are no absolute rules for cost for a spinoff. However, when you look at a number of deals, and we've done some analysis on several deals over the past several years, we generally offer that costs will be in the range of 4 to 8% of the SpinCo entity revenue. So there's no exact science to this, and in fact, each deal has its own complexity and variables that make it unique. But typically, you can expect somewhere in the range of 4 to 8% of SpinCo revenues.
Got it, Jason. So what's driving these costs? What's behind them? Because I think if you want to have a fighting chance to better manage and minimize the cost, you need to know what's behind it all.
So if you look at those three buckets of cost that we talked about earlier in the context of complexity, there are drivers for each of those. So let's start off with transaction costs. A key complexity driver for the transaction itself is focused around the complexity of the structure of the deal. It's around the number of jurisdictions and legal entities, and or maybe related to the complexity of the financing requirements in order to affect the spinoff. So that's the complexity around the transaction bucket. Around separation, the main driver of cost in a separation is led by the level of entanglement with the parent. So think about the IT systems, the finance systems and operations, the shared services. The level of entanglement between the two companies will really drive much of the complexity there, as well as the number of markets and geographic reach. So if you have a company that's all US based, and even though it may be fully integrated with the parent and the SpinCo, it's a little bit more easy than a company that's planning to spin off an entity or a company that has business in 40 different markets. So those are the two drivers in the separation cost bucket. And as I said, key drivers within that would be the level of commingled sales and commercial teams, the level of manufacturing and warehouse integration, as well as other functional and IT integration. Of course, as many know, ERP is often a big cost driver in any transformational program, and certainly relevant here in a spinoff. The net of that is really the more integrated the business, the more complexity is involved and the associated costs. In the last bucket, the employee-related costs, and that's really driven by the level of change and restructuring involved in the spinoff. Key drivers would be the reorganization to be able to affect the spin. Or it might be the management of stranded costs. Sometimes when you spin off a company, you're left with a huge infrastructure that's just not right sized for the new parent company go forward. And other times, as you do a spin, the company wants to change the headquarters. Maybe it's better for growth to be in a certain geographic region, or the talent is better. So those are a number of drivers that can really drive the total cost of the transaction. So in summary, you have these three buckets, and there are drivers within each of them that can really make a big difference on the cost profile of the deal.
Jason, would it be useful to think in terms of phases, pre-close, post-close? Is that helpful in a practical sort of way?
Yes, of course. And this kind of relates to my earlier point around strategy and how the approach can make a difference on costs. We discussed that costs are often driven by complexity, but they're also driven, at least when looking at pre-close versus post-close, by the approach and strategy taken towards the spin. Let's discuss two examples. Let's assume Company A and Company B. Company A is focused on spinning off a division and really wants to reduce the burden of the parent company and minimize the costs and capital to close the transaction. So in this case, the parent company, when spinning off the entity, will probably rely heavily on TSAs or commercial agreements, but the ultimate result is that the two businesses will be quite integrated post-close. So in essence, they can minimize the cost to separate pre-close, but they're going to make some trade-offs in that as they get to close and look forward as two companies, they're going to be heavily integrated for a period of time. And in fact, some of those costs will still be there as they have to split the company later. Let's compare that to a Company B, who's really focused on restructuring their business prior to the spin-off to allow both companies the flexibility and readiness to drive business priorities following the spin. And there's some great examples of companies today that are using the spin-off to both drive change in the parent company as well as the SpinCo entity. These companies are very proactively making significant changes before the spin and thus have a higher profile on the costs. That said, I always encourage my clients to think about the total cost to separate. There are a number of strategic trade-offs as you think about costs and spending on a pre-close and post-close, but at the end of the day, you really got to think about the total costs of the program for the eventual separation, and then think about your strategic business priorities and make those trade-offs as it relates to cost.
So, Jason, you talked a little bit earlier about buckets, and it sounds like it's going to cost us a bucket of capital in order to be able to do this sort of thing. Is there really any reasonable way that we can ameliorate these costs, that we can lower our expenses?
Certainly, there are ways to manage the costs on the spinoff, and we discussed this broadly in the context of the approach and strategy. However, there are a number of specific levers or areas of focus that are also helpful to consider in line with the strategy. To highlight a few of them, first, I want to focus around aligning the teams up front on strong guiding principles and alignment to the strategy and approach. The more the teams turn on decisions and approach, the more costs will escalate. Secondly, you really want to focus to utilize your top performers and employee base. Leveraging dedicated internal resources where possible will help to minimize external costs and drive progress. Thirdly, consider your go-to-market model and opportunities to leverage that model. So a lot of companies, when they do a spinoff, they recognize that particularly outside the U.S., they don't have the scale to be effective or to be profitable in ex-U.S. countries. And some companies take the approach of just replicate whatever we have today. Other companies take the opportunity to maximize or optimize, I should say, their channel and maybe decide to go to a distributor in one market, or maybe it's not profitable to be in that market as a SpinCo. So taking the opportunity to look at the strategy and the markets that you're in and make sure that it aligns and it's worth the cost to replicate what you have today. The last 2 points I would say, like we talked about in the strategy, you can leverage the TSAs to reduce the upfront costs. Now, you have to be a little bit careful about that because that creates some other strategic trade-offs, and eventually you have to separate the business. So to some extent, that's a delay of the cost as opposed to a total cost reduction. And then the last thing I would say is we really need to focus around strong program governance and cost management. And this is true with anything. The more you focus and provide visibility to the costs, the better that you can manage the costs. In summary, there are a number of areas that you can focus on to manage the costs of the spin. I think the most important aspect is to align the strategy with the objectives and goals of managing the costs and to proactively put in place the structure and key levers to manage the costs during the implementation.
I'm Greg Jarrett, and thanks for listening to Deloitte M&A Views, sponsored by Deloitte's M&A Institute. We release new podcasts regularly, and if you subscribe, you won't miss a single one. To stay connected and receive more information on Deloitte M&A service offerings, visit www.deloitte.com/US/MA subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Deloitte M&A. Until next time.